Hello, everyone. My name is Triandafyllidou. I'm the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University in Toronto. And I'm very happy to welcome you at this panel of the ILERA2020 conference. The title of our panel is Labor Market Integration of Skilled Migrants in Canada, Challenges and Opportunities. We have four distinguished speakers, actually, who are experts on this topic, and I will be very pleased to introduce them one by one. Our first speaker is Naomi Alboim, who is a distinguished fellow and adjunct professor at the School of Policy Studies, Queen's University, Kingston. And actually, I can say that by the time this video will be projected, Naomi will have also joined our team as a senior fellow, working with us on issues of labor market integration of migrants and advising on policy. Naomi has a very long career in both government and research positions and has advised the government of Canada, the EU, and several countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa on these topics. She has published widely on migration management and labor market integration. And actually, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Naomi.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Rupa, for having put together this panel, which I'm looking forward to hearing from the other people on. This is an area that I have been working in, as Anna has indicated, for many decades, and I'm going to be doing a kind of overview today as an introduction to the other presentations by the other three panelists. So to sort of set the stage, give some background and give some context. And I've titled this presentation, Improving Outcomes for Skilled Immigrants. You can go on to the next slide, please.
Sure.
Just to give you an indication of what I'll be covering, I will be talking first of all, next slide, please. I will be talking first of all about what is the problem that we want to address? What are some of the possible causes for the problem? Some interventions that have been considered, and many have in fact been implemented to try to address the problem. Looking at two-step immigration as a solution. Some concerns and cautionary notes, and then I'll just have some concluding comments. So first of all, what's the problem? I'm sure everybody is very familiar with this issue, but basically we are going to be focusing on the fact that although principal applicants of the economic class certainly have better outcomes than other immigrants to Canada, these immigrants, despite the fact that they've been selected specifically to contribute to Canada's economy, have worse outcomes than native-born Canadians. It takes them longer to catch up to native-born Canadians than it did previously. They experience both higher unemployment and higher underemployment rates than native-born, although the underemployment issue is a more significant one. They have lower incomes than the native-born. And all this together results in a significant loss to the Canadian economy, certainly brain waste, personal disappointment on behalf of the immigrants who have chosen to come to Canada, and de-skilling. Next. Now, people over time have looked at trying to do the diagnostic as to what are the possible causes for this state of affairs, and different people have focused on different issues, but there are many potential possible causes. The first, is it gaps in the immigrants themselves? Is it that we are not selecting the right immigrants to come to Canada? Are we not adequately assessing the immigrants to identify the gaps that may need to be addressed so that employers and other institutions actually recognize the immigrants' qualifications that they come to Canada with? Or is it, is it lack of labor market information? Is it the fact that we're not matching our selection of immigrants to labor market needs because we have inadequate labor market information and forecasting ability? And or is it lack of pre-arrival preparation for the immigrants coming to Canada, where immigrants don't know what to expect and don't have access to the information and advice they need in order to prepare for their immigration and to prepare for their labor market integration. There are other possible, next please. There are other possible causes. Some people have posited that it's the post-arrival services that are inadequate, that they're not geared to labor market integration of skilled immigrants in an integrated way. The language training is too basic, it's not geared to labor market needs, and the language training isn't flexible enough. Others say that the settlement services provided don't focus enough on labor market integration. And others say that education and training programs are not geared to filling the gaps that need to be filled and require the immigrants to start all over again. There are also very significant institutional barriers. Regulatory bodies and their processes either prevent or delay licensure to practice, particularly in regulated occupations. Colleges and universities are not flexible enough to provide gap-filling courses to immigrants who may need them. Employers are risk-averse, and that's a polite way of describing in some instances, but employers are risk-averse to hire immigrants with foreign credentials or foreign work experience and who have no local references. And others say that stakeholders are not working together in a coordinated, collaborative way to address all the problems. Next, please. This takes me back in time. In 2002, I wrote a paper for the Banerjee Foundation, which proposed a systems approach to facilitate labor market integration of skilled immigrants. The paper was called Fulfilling the Promise, and it was a double entendre. It was addressing the need for Canada to fulfill its promise to the immigrants that it selected to come to Canada so that immigrants themselves could fulfill their promise or their potential in terms of their contribution to the labor market. This schema, a very simple one, started off at the top with a leadership council, which would require all the various stakeholders involved in the exercise of labor market integration to work together in a collaborative way to design and develop and deliver a whole series of programs and services. The first tranche, in fact, delivered overseas before immigrants ever even arrived in Canada, to provide them with information to do the assessment of language, of education, of competencies, to provide labor market counseling and development of potential learning plans to fill some of the gaps that have been identified in the assessment processes, and to provide them with a mentor of a Canadian practitioner while they were still abroad. Once they arrived in Canada, they would be able to access a whole series of integrated bridging programs to fill all the identified gaps that had been identified as a result of the assessments. And these gaps could be in terms of academic courses, it could be labor market language training, it could be technical skills upgrading, it could be work experience to gain experience and knowledge of Canadian workplace practices here. On the left-hand side, you see that the point would be for skilled immigrants to be able to access all those programs and services that provide with whatever incentives they may need to participate. On the right-hand side, you see incentives for stakeholders, and that would be for employers, for community colleges, for universities to actively engage in this model, and most importantly, for regulated occupations to work with the regulatory bodies to do regulatory reviews to make sure that people working in regulated occupations would not face unnecessary barriers. That was the model, 2002. Next, please. Since that time, many initiatives have been implemented in Canada incrementally over the years. We have, in fact, put into place information portals, some would argue too many information portals, to provide information to immigrants while they are still overseas. We have done mandatory language assessment, both in order to assign points in the point system for economic immigrants, but also to determine what kind of language training they might need in Canada. There has been mandatory academic credential assessment, and Jeff will be talking about the effectiveness of that assessment that is now done across the board for all economic immigrants wanting to come to Canada. Canada implemented something called the Canadian Immigration Integration Program, which was available in most of the major source countries of immigrants to Canada, where people, once they had been approved in principle for immigration to Canada, would have access to pre-arrival information, to counseling, to mentoring, to referral to jobs potentially, but also to referral to settlement agencies so they could start that relationship before they even came to Canada. In that particular CIIP initiative, those individuals who actually took part in that initiative, all the evaluations have shown that that pre-arrival introduction was in fact very helpful and did result in positive impacts once people arrived here. A series of bridge training programs were introduced across the country. They started, in fact, in Ontario to fill the gaps once people were assessed if they did need additional language or additional skills training. Community colleges and universities would offer these bridge training programs. They have been evaluated to be very, very effective, particularly given that they all have work experience components in their bridge training programs. However, they are not universally available. They're only available for some occupations in some locations. Advanced labor market and occupation-specific language training, again, was introduced in Canada. It varies significantly across the country. Not all communities offer the variety of levels and the variety of occupation-specific language training. Internships were shown to be quite useful, but they're very expensive, and they were not universally available. Mentorships are becoming more and more available across the country. And they too have been found to be very successful in linking up the social networks and the social capital of mentors to fairly newly arrived immigrants. So they have not just the human capital they brought with them, but the social capital that they get from their mentors. The federal government introduced a whole series of initiatives on a federal, provincial, territorial basis to look at foreign qualification recognition, and an office was set up, foreign credential recognition office, primarily to work with regulatory bodies on a federal, provincial, territorial basis across the country. Some regulators really rose to the occasion and did some excellent work, others perhaps not so much. And fairness commissions were established in a variety of provinces across the country, some more successful than others. There was another very interesting network established in some centers across the country. I, in fact, was the founder of TRIAC, one of the founders of TRIAC, which was the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. And that was really to work primarily with employers. All of the other things that I've mentioned are great in terms of addressing some of the needs of the immigrants, but unless employers are ready and willing and open to hiring people with education that was achieved abroad, with training and credentials that were achieved abroad, with no references from having worked in Canada, unless employers are engaged, this will not be successful. So a number of these immigrant employment councils across the country were set up, primarily employer-led, employer-driven, to provide training and supports and consultation and incentives for employers to engage in the hiring of skilled immigrants. Next, please. There were other attempts as well to facilitate labor market integration. At one point in our selection criteria, the federal government determined priority occupations for admissions, and only those individuals with backgrounds in particular occupations were admitted to Canada. This was determined to be very unsuccessful. We could never bring in, first of all, there was not one single national labor market in Canada. Identifying national priority occupations didn't make much sense. But we were also behind the 8 ball. And once we determined what the priorities were until people were processed and came to Canada, it was not terribly successful. The government experimented with guaranteed job offers. And that too was not as successful as people had hoped. I'm getting the signals and I'm nowhere where I should be. But what was very successful was the growth in provincial nominee programs. And that was to respond particularly to regional needs and to local employer needs expeditiously, and provincial nominees were given priority in processing. Another thing that started happening as early as 2002 was that what used to be a very small temporary foreign worker program started to grow exponentially. And there was a low skill pilot that was introduced in 2002 for people entering temporary work that required less skills. And this grew exponentially. There was a Canadian experience class that was introduced, an introduction of a job bank that was not very successful in my view. And then the previous administration decided that they really want to focus on getting the best and the brightest of immigrants and immigrants who could hit the ground running, and change the selection criteria pretty significantly to increase the points for assessed language and educational equivalency, to increase the points for youth, to assign points for Canadian work experience and Canadian education experience. Next, please. All that took us down the path to a significant degree to two-step immigration, which Feng will be talking about much more. But look at these numbers. From 2000 to 2018, the number of temporary work permit holders in Canada increased from 66,000 in 2000 to 429,000 in 2018. Now compare that to the 300,000 permanent residents that were admitted in 2018. So significantly more temporary entrants with work permits were admitted in that year. But remember that although there's a huge pool, only some of them can actually transition to permanent residency, either through the provincial nominee program or through express entry or through some pilots. Only about 50,000 were actually transitioned from temporary residency to permanent residency. On the other hand, when you look on those who were admitted under permanent residency, 59% of the economic principal applicants came to Canada first as temporary entrants and had pre-immigration Canadian earnings in 2018 compared to 12% in 2000. And now Canadian work experience can provide up to 40% of the passing score required to be eligible for express entry. It is true that those with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings have the best employment and income outcomes. So is this the silver bullet, or are there potentially some concerns? And I'm going to stop. I know I'm going over time, but I just will do this as quickly as I can. There are some real concerns about that first step of two-step immigration. Temporary entrants do have fewer rights than permanent residents, particularly in terms of mobility. Many of them are tied to a particular employer and are therefore vulnerable to exploitation because their work permit is employer specific. They are ineligible for federally funded services that would help in their integration, yet the employers who bring them in are not required to provide any services to them. Many cannot bring their families with them during their temporary period, or they choose not to given the uncertainty of being here temporarily and the costs of foreign fees for their children's education. For those who do transition after their temporary period to permanent residency, their eligibility for citizenship is delayed. And those most lower skilled, lower paid, more vulnerable temporary foreign workers have no option to transition to permanent residency. So they either remain as temporary workers, vulnerable because of their status, or they go underground, or they return home, taking their expertise and experience with them. Next, please. Still more concerns about that first step. It does influence employer behavior. Having access to so many temporary foreign workers and temporary entrants does encourage them to look at the short-term, low-cost labor focus rather than the longer-term workforce planning. It can result in wage suppression. It can result in displacement of domestic workers. It's a disincentive to invest in training, technology, and infrastructure. It's a disincentive to employers to improve working conditions or benefits to attract domestic employees. It's a disincentive to hire and train underrepresented domestic employees or unemployed, underemployed immigrants already in the country. And as controls were put in by the government on the temporary foreign worker program, employers found it was just as easy, if not easier, to hire people in the international mobility program who require no labor market test at all. And because there is no LMIA, labor market impact assessment, we really have very little data about those who came in under the international mobility program. There is no monitoring done, there's no control done, and there's no evaluation. Both the Standing Committee of Human Resources of Parliament and the Auditor General have expressed many, many concerns about both the temporary foreign worker program and the international mobility program. Next, please. There are also concerns about the criteria under express entry for the second step of two-step immigration. The language requirements, which I understand are a key predictor of success in Canada, and it is on the basis of evidence that language points were increased. However, the unintended consequence, perhaps, is that it really has impacted applicants from non-English speaking countries. And applicants from China have really gone down very significantly, and Chinese immigrants in Canada have done extraordinarily well, as have the second generation. Their children have done remarkably well. So that is potentially a concern. Because youth is rewarded very significantly in the express entry system, more younger applicants are coming forward. 57% of the economic class are now principal applicants, which means that there are many singles coming or many couples coming as opposed to families coming under the economic class. And we know that younger people are footloose and fancy free, and they will go wherever they have a good opportunity. So they don't necessarily establish the roots that older people or families would put down in Canada. The express entry system is very, very difficult for tradespeople to qualify for, even though we have a remarkable need for tradespeople in Canada. We have a much more highly educated pool, lots of people with PhDs, and the PhDs are not doing as well as people with bachelor's degrees, in fact. So we have a very overqualified pool and perhaps an underemployed, overqualified pool. The regulated occupations are still very problematic. We do have some caregiver pilots, but they're far too small to meet the demand for people to look after our children and our elderly parents. And because it's restricted to OAB job classifications, the demand for people to fill non-OAB job vacancies can't be met by express entry. And employers either have to take advantage of the few provincial nominee programs that do allow for non-OAB individuals to transition to permanent residency, or they are pushed to use temporary work permit holders. So in conclusion, and this is the last slide you will be happy to know. In conclusion, I think pursuing an immigration policy that rewards as much as we do primarily skilled economic immigrants with pre-immigration Canadian earnings perpetuates, in my view, the flaws of the temporary foreign worker and the international mobility program unless those flaws are addressed. Number two, restricting principal applicants in the express entry systems, those with OAB experience and high human capital, ignores the real need for people to work in other growing and essential parts of the economy, as we have certainly found out with COVID. COVID has certainly shone a light of who the essential workers are. And that pushes employers to employ temporary workers with little opportunity to transition to permanent residency. This could result, and this is my biggest fear, that this could result in a bifurcated workplace and a bifurcated society where permanent residents and Canadian citizens working in higher skilled, higher paying jobs, and vulnerable temporary workers employed in lower skilled, lower paying jobs. And I ask whether that's the kind of society we want. So the question really is, if all these temporary workers are being admitted to satisfy labor market needs, and there are jobs for them, should we perhaps not focus instead on increasing the number of permanent residents across all skill levels admitted from the outset as permanent residents with full rights, access to services, and on the path to citizenship? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I mean, you did go over the time, but it is true also that this was like a short history or, you know, your crash course into the Canadian policies for highly skilled migrants, the turn to temporariness, and really the pitfalls and advantages of both channels. I think we're going to delve a bit more into these issues with the subsequent presentations, and I'm very happy to introduce Jeff Reitz. Again, I'm afraid in the Canadian context, Jeff needs little introduction, but as ILERA is an international conference, I'm happy to say that Jeff is the R.F. Harney Professor at the Mont School at the University of Toronto, where he directs the Ethnic Immigration and Pluralism Studies program. Jeff has also written widely on intergroup relations and on issues of labor market integration and public policy relating to migration. And Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Hello, everyone. I would first like to express my pleasure in being in this group, participating with this group. Thank you, Rupa, for organizing it. And I look forward to the discussion we're going to have. In 2013, following on Naomi's paper, she noted that immigrant selection in Canada was modified for the federal skilled worker program to mandate that the foreign acquired educational credentials of principal applicants be assessed in terms of equivalency to Canadian qualifications as a condition of their acceptance as permanent residents in Canada. And the study I'm going to talk about is, I think, the first assessment of how that policy change is working. We use the Longitudinal Immigration Database, the IMDb, which is, I think, the best data available. And this was a team effort led by Rupa Banerjee here in our panel, and Feng Hu of Statistics Canada, who also did all of the data analysis, thanks to Feng, and myself and Tingting Zhang at Merrimack College School of Business in Massachusetts. The Federal Skilled Worker Program is, as Naomi said, the traditional points selected category of economic immigrant. And prior to 2013, the educational qualification requirements under the point system did not include any kind of formal assessment of Canadian equivalence. And this has become quite controversial feature of the program, since the labor market performance of these immigrants had declined through several successive cohorts since the introduction of the point system about 1970. And there was a fairly intense debate about the reasons for this decline. In general, the reasons why immigrants were unable to translate their educational qualifications into commensurate labor market success. Was it the qualifications of the immigrants were not really equivalent to those of native-born Canadians, either in terms of quality or relevance to the Canadian requirement? Or was it that they were equivalent but not fully recognized by Canadian employers, or other forms of labor market discrimination were occurring, conscious or unconscious, implicit discrimination, particularly against immigrants of non-European background? So the new selection requirement was designed to address this issue, to ensure that the degree of equivalence in the qualifications on the basis of which skilled immigrants were being selected for admission to permanent residency in Canada. So next slide. Do you have the slides? That's just the title slide. The next slide. Yeah, great. The disappointing employment outcome for skilled immigrants in Canada is extensively documented, and if the qualifications were truly equivalent, their non-use in the workforce would be costing Canadian economy many billions of dollars per year. So there's been some attempt to assess the various reasons for this in terms of skill deficit, as Naomi's laid it out very well. Skill deficit, skill underutilization, discriminatory labor markets, processes of various kinds. And while the studies have supported all of these explanations, they have not really been entirely conclusive about the relative magnitude of each of these factors. Next slide, please. Still, the issue of getting immigrants selected on education into jobs commensurate with that education has been significant enough to inspire a range of policy interventions, including regulations to ensure fair access to occupational licensing, the availability of credential assessment services in Canada, and programs to help immigrants adjust to labor market conditions, such as bridge training, professionally focused language training. As well, immigrant selection policy has been changed, including not only increasing the credential requirements, which was particularly going on in the 1990s, but in the Harper government years, including emphasis on admitting immigrants with some prior Canadian experience, either as temporary immigrants or international immigrants, or relying on provincial governments to help tie immigrants to local labor market conditions. These initiatives may have helped to a degree, although there is no real overall assessment that leads to the conclusion that the foreign credentials issue has been satisfactorily addressed. Next slide. So the new requirement for educational credential assessment for equivalence to be done as a condition of and before admission to Canada is a move that many thought could be a game changer to ensure that persons who have, say, a bachelor's degree that is clearly not equivalent to Canadian could not be admitted and become a statistic lamented by as showing the failure of Canadian immigration. The educational assessments are to be done by independent companies certified as capable based on extensive knowledge of educational training, and in other countries. These include, for example, World Educational Services, which is the agency mandated for foreign credential assessment by the Ontario government. Getting these immigrants starting in 2013 into the country in large numbers was slowed by the immigration backlog. But by 2015, most principal applicants who arrived under the Federal Skilled Worker Program had applied after May 2013, and so were subjected to the ECA, the equivalent educational equivalent credential assessment equivalence requirement. Because of the Canadian expansion of the Canadian experience class and the provincial nominee programs, these federal skilled worker applicants are a smaller component than they used to be, but they are still significant. I think 20% of permanent residents coming into Canada in 2015 were principal applicants in the federal skilled worker program and subject to the mandate. Slide 5. Next slide. So we asked, does the mandatory credential assessment improve post-migration outcomes for skilled immigrants? The answer theoretically depends on the significance of different reasons for immigrant disadvantage. If the foreign credential recognition is lacking because the qualifications themselves are problematic, then the new ECA requirement should serve to bar these candidates from being accepted. They would be in effect weeded out in the selection process. If the problem is employer reluctance or lack of familiarity, the ECA requirement could perhaps provide immigrants with an authoritative evidence that their credentials are in fact equivalent. That's why those services are there, just to empower immigrants in this way. To the extent that skill recognition problem is due to neither of these, but rather outright discrimination based on race or national origin, then the new requirements would have little effect. We suggest in the paper that it might be the case that if over time the higher grade of credentials brought into Canada could erode the discriminatory stereotypes that may apply. But in the short term, this new policy would not have an effect to offset the effect of discrimination. Next slide. The Longitudinal Database links immigrant landing records and the annual tax information going back to 1980, and it's been continuous since every year since then. We sampled the federal skilled workers to compare with the other economic immigrants, the Canadian experienced class and PNPs, provincial nominees, who are not subject, and others non-subject to the ECA requirement. We have before and after tests by sampling those landing in 2013 and 2015. Our analysis is restricted to those between ages of 20 and 54. And you can see there the size of the population is fairly large for this kind of analysis. So next slide, please. The basic framework is to look at two outcomes, whether employed and indicated by submitting a tax return earning more than $100 a year, and also annual employment income for those employed. And we compare the arrival cohorts and the immigration categories according to the ECA requirement, and expect that the ECA equivalence policy effect would be seen in the so-called difference in difference, the difference between the difference in arrival cohorts for the federal skilled workers who became subject to ECA requirements and the others who were not. In the regression models, this is captured by the interaction term between the joint effect of those two explanatory variables. Next slide. Our model 1 includes just the basic variables, the arrival cohort, immigration category, and the interaction. So you can see the basic framework there. Model 2 adds, it's really the key because it looks at the same variables with controls for the human capital and other individual factors known to affect employment outcomes, which are listed there. Pre-migration educational level, official language ability, age since arrival, and so on, region of origin, and urban residence in Canada. And Model 3 adds pre-immigration earnings in Canada because, as has been discussed, we expected that those with pre-immigration earnings who returned to become permanent residents would already have tested the waters, so to speak, so knew what they could do in Canada. So the effect of the ECA requirement would be less for them. But we have, this is a control, but we also do a separate analysis of models 1 and 2 for those with pre-immigration and employment experiences and those without. Next slide. So regarding, these are results, I have 4 slides here. Regarding employment, we can see that for both men and women, the rate for federal skilled workers of employment in the first year increased by more between the cohorts than it did for the cohorts not subject to the ECA requirement. For men, it was 2%, for women, 3%. When we partial out the effect of pre-immigration earnings, the difference became 4% for men and 6% for women. So this is a significant effect simply on getting a job within the first year. Notice I put boxes around just the models 2 and 3. The unadjusted rates in model 1 are affected by demographic changes in the educational and other profiles of demographics for those categories, so they're of less interest. So the next slide is on earnings. Next slide. And we see here that the effect, it's a positive effect again for both men and women, where there is control for, and when there's control for pre-immigration earnings. The effect of the ECA requirement, independent of controls, is quite large. It's 0.267 for men. I should say we're logging the earnings, so this can be roughly interpreted in proportional terms, like a 25% boost in earnings and 24% for women. So that's, I think, quite a substantial impact. The next slide, we're looking at the split sample and to focus more clearly on the impact of pre-immigration earnings and repeat the analysis for those with and without previous Canadian experience. And we find that for employment, that the improvement in employment for federal skilled workers for men and women is greater for those not having worked previously in Canada, and it's significant for those, it's not significant for those who had such experience. It seems that the ECA requirement is not affecting those who have been in Canada before, only those who are not. And the final slide on earnings, it's very striking. Among those without previous experience in Canada, the earnings gain for the federal skilled workers as a result of the ECA, or in the 2015 cohort, is 0.22 for men and 0.23 for women, whereas those with previous experience, the effects are much smaller, 7% for men and insignificant for women. So the next slide is a summary slide, and just basically the ECA requirement for equivalence, educational equivalence, seems to have substantially boosted the first-year employment rates and earnings for men and women in the federal skilled worker program, net of controls. And this effect is seen almost entirely for those without previous Canadian experience. This very positive outcome suggests that either the requirement is restricting those with defective requirements from coming in, or that these workers are as a group empowered by their having had the assessment readily available when they seek employment. Either way, it seems like a plus for Canadian immigration. Further issues, though, on the next slide, of course, how long the effect might be observed would depend on the reasons why it's happening. If it's due to the selection effect, it could be long-lasting because the qualifications of immigrants have actually been upgraded. If it's due to signaling, to the employers about the quality of the credentials, improving the ability of immigrants to demonstrate their qualification to employers, then the initial effect might fade over time so that the other immigrants eventually will be able to demonstrate the value of their skills. One other finding is quite interesting here, I think, is we look to see if the ECA requirement had helped explain the differences by origin groups, often linked, of course, to the issue of discrimination. We found that even after the effect of the ECA requirement is taken into account, substantial differences in earnings among groups, origin groups, remain higher for European and American immigrants, less for Asian, African, and Caribbean immigrants. So actually this in a way strengthens the discrimination interpretation of the overall position of the immigrant groups, since the disadvantages for those origin groups persist even where the assessed quality of their educational credentials is equivalent. So last slide. That's the presentation, and look forward to any comments or questions. The paper is in submission, so we can still make corrections and revisions. And so there's our email addresses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So you seem to have provided partly the answer to some of the questions that Naomi was raising, and it seems that the educational credential assessment is working, although something tells me that we'll hear more about it in this panel. And yeah, without losing much time, I would like to invite Feng, who is a principal researcher with Stats Canada in social analysis and modeling, and he is also an adjunct professor at the University of Western Ontario. to take the floor and present his paper. Feng.
Two-step immigration selection. Jeff also touched on some materials on two-step selection. So what I'm going to do is to provide the details about the expansion of two-step selection in Canada, as well as its effect on immigrant labor market outcomes. This presentation is based on a report I recently prepared in collaboration with Eden Crossman and Gard Pico for research and evaluation division of immigration, refugees, and citizenship Canada. So two-step immigration selection refers to the selection of economic immigrants from among temporary foreign workers. In the first step, employer play a major role in recruiting and evaluating temporary foreign workers. In the second step, the government decides how many and which temporary foreign workers are eligible for permanent residency. Although in Canada, employers still play a role in some provincial anomaly programs. The two-step selection in Canada is different from the employer-sponsored economic immigration in the United States. In the US, employers play a key role in both the first step and the second step, because temporary foreign workers application for permanent residency has to be sponsored by their employers. But in Canada, in the second step, the government maintains the control in terms of who can transition into a permanent residence. So the Canadian system has a built-in mechanism to mitigate some of the potential risks associated with two-step selection. Is the risk that Naomi outlined in her presentation. So if you look at the charts, in 2018, about 59% of economic principal applicants had worked in Canada before immigration, as indicated by pre-immigration Canadian earnings. That was a large increase from 12% in 2000. Also, the chart shows that different economic immigration programs use two-step selection differently. Almost all Canadian experience class principal applicants had pre-immigration Canadian earnings. About 62% of provincial programs had pre-immigration Canadian earnings. That, again, is a large increase from 11% in 2000. Among federal skilled work, the share with pre-immigration Canadian earnings went up and down, but in most years, stayed below 20%. There are many advantages and also potential risks of two-step immigration selection. The key advantage, including a better match between immigrant skills and labor market demand, because the employer can directly assess the temporary foreign workers' skill and intangible qualities. Temporary foreign workers can test out their life in Canada before deciding whether or not to pursue permanent residence. Temporary foreign workers who performed well are unlikely to have difficulties with the portability of their home capital. And the two-step selection has been regarded as an efficient avenue to fill a specific regional and sectoral labor market needs. Now, those are the possible advantages, but there are also many potential risks. I think Naomi did a great job outlining what are those risks are, so I'm not going to repeat them for the sake of time. But it's important to keep in mind that when I talk about the positive aspect of two-step selection, we need to consider their potential risks, and we have to do our best to mitigate of those potential risks. So what did the recent expansion of two-step immigrant selection in Canada happen? There are three factors. The first is a large increase in the number of temporary foreign workers. From 2000 to 2018, the number of temporary foreign work permit holders in Canada increased like sixfold, from 66,000 in 2000 to 249,000 in 2018. Those numbers are actually based on the number in the last day of each year. So it's kind of the lower bound of the temporary foreign work presented in Canada. If you look at those people who ever worked during a year, the number is actually much higher. Now, the second factor is the increased transition from temporary residence, from temporary foreign work to permanent residency. For example, among those who arrived in, first arrived in 2001, 10 years after, about like 30% of them become permanent residents. And that transition rate increased to 39% for the 2006 arriving cohort. And the third factor is the change in the composition of economic immigration programs. We saw the expansion of provincial programs, and the share of PNP among economic immigrants is reached almost like 50%. We also, from previous slide, know that the PNP program also increasingly relied on the temporary foreign works as the feeding pool. Another big change in the program is the introduction of Canadian experience class in 2008. So by definition, almost everybody, all the principal applicants in Canadian experience class had Canadian work experience before they become non-immigrants. So now I'm going to turn to the question about how two-step immigration selection is related to the recent trend in immigrant labor market outcomes. I will start with the first year employment rate. As the chart shows that there are very large differences in the first year employment rate among immigrants with different levels of pre-immigration Canadian earnings. So among those with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings and median pre-immigration Canadian earnings, almost all of them continue to be employed after the immigration. Here, the high pre-immigration Canadian earnings basically refers to annual earnings over $50,000, and the median pre-immigration Canadian earnings refers to 20,000 to 50,000 annual earnings. So it's not a lot. And the low pre-immigration Canadian earnings refers to annual earning less than $20,000. So as you can see, there's a huge difference in the employment rate between those with Canadian earnings before immigration and those who did a lot. In terms of the trend, the first 4-year employment rate increased 6 percentage points for immigrant men and 5 percentage points for immigrant women between 2001 and 2016 entering cohort. That's actually like a big increase, considering that over the same period, there is basically low change in the employment rate among the Canadian-born population. And our analysis shows that about 2/3 of the increase in the employment rate among new immigrants are accounted for by the rising share of immigrants with pre-immigration Canadian earnings. We found the similar patterns in terms of immigrant entry earnings. Entry earnings here refers to the earnings in the first year after the landing year. again, from the chart, we saw there's a huge difference between immigrants with pre-Canadian, pre-immigration Canadian earnings and those with low level of pre-immigration Canadian earnings and those without pre-immigration Canadian earnings. The group with high pre-immigration Canadian earnings really stand out. Their earnings is about like 3 to 4 times as high as those without pre-immigration Canadian earnings. Again, in terms of the trend, between the 2000 and 2016 entrant cohorts, the average entrant earnings increased 23% among immigrant men and 30% among immigrant women. And we found that over 90% of the increase in entrant earnings over this period are associated with the rising share of immigrants with median and high pre-immigration Canadian earnings. So what we just saw is like the what we call short-term effect, the effect in the very initial years of after immigration. What about the long-term effect? So for that, we can only look at those who came a little bit early. In fact, we focus on those who arrived between 2000 and 2005. So we can follow them for at least 10 years. So what we found is that even after 10 years after immigration, immigrants with pre-immigration Canadian earnings still had about 4 to 8 percentage points advantage in the employment rate over immigrants who are admitted directly from abroad. And by the 10th year, immigrants with low, median, and high pre-immigration Canadian earnings and earned more than immigrants without pre-immigration Canadian earnings by 9%, 35%, and 210% respectively. So even after we controlling for difference in a bunch of social demographic factors. So the difference by pre-immigration Canadian earnings level, the difference actually lasts even after 10 years after the immigration. And also I want to talk about how two-step selection can help us understand the difference in the labor market outcomes by admission class. Previous studies have found that provincial nominee program immigrants as well as Canadian experience class immigrants have better employment rate and earnings than federal school workers, at least during the early years after landing in Canada. And when we look at the data, more recent data among those who arrived in 2009 to 12, we found that the findings from previous studies are still applied. So in the first year, both PNP and CEC immigrants had a higher employment rate and higher earnings than federal school workers. In the 5th year, PNP immigrants still had a higher employment rate in federal school work, but they tend to have lower earnings than federal school work. But Canadian experienced class immigrants continue to have higher employment rate and earnings than federal school works. And then we found that about 40% to 6% of CEC and PNP's advantage in employment and over 90% of CEC advantage in earnings are related to the higher share with pre-immigration Canadian earnings than immigrants in the federal school work programs. So in summary, we saw that two-step immigrant selection has expanded rapidly in Canada over the last 15 to 20 years. And immigrants who went through the two-step selection have higher employment rate and earnings, both at entry and in the long term. And the expansion of two-step selection accounts for most of the recent improvement in new immigrants' employment and earnings. And also, two-step selection explains much of the variation in labor market outcomes across economic immigration programs. But one thing we didn't do in this study, we couldn't do, is to locate the possible risks associated with two-step selection. But those are important topics. We will try to find some data to look into it in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Feng. So here we have, I think, some arguments that contradict Naomi's initial message, which was we should kind of steer away from the two-step selection. But we have seen here some of the advantages. But obviously, Feng clearly said, I'm not discussing in this paper the disadvantages. So let me give the floor to Rupa, who actually has been the organizer of this panel and also our technical host and advisor. Rupa is an associate professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University, and is a professor in human resource management, but has worked a lot on labor market integration of immigrants and particularly issues of discrimination. And Rupa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen. See how that goes. So in this presentation, I'm going to follow up the other presentations and really look at some very similar kinds of issues, kind of sticking with the theme that we're focusing on in this panel. And I thought it was great for me to go after Feng, because while his presentation really looked at the differences in outcomes for different categories of immigration within immigrants, the study that I'm going to be talking about looks at earnings disparities compared to native-born comparators and how admission category impacts that, and how relative to the native-born counterparts, immigrants of different admission categories fare. So the title of the paper, which is currently under review, is Policies, Pitfalls, and Potentials, the Impact of Admission Category on Earnings Disparity of Economic Immigrants. So I'm not going to go into a deep explanation of the context or the kind of background, because that's already been done in the other presentations. So I'm going to just jump right into the objectives of the study, talk a little bit about the data and methodology, the results, the summary, and then I'm happy to discuss and take questions. So in this paper, my co-author and I were really interested in how admission category affects the earnings gap between economic recent immigrants and native-born Canadians. And so this was only possible at this point because we now have access to immigration category in the 2016 census. So before the release of the 2016 census microdata, we didn't have a great way to actually compare how immigrants of different admission categories were doing relative to their Canadian-born counterparts. So we're exploiting this new feature of the census to actually look at that. We also expanded our analyses a little further to look at how these earnings gaps between the different admission categories fare at different points on the earnings distribution. So those who earn, say, at the 10th percentile versus those who earn, say, at the 90th percentile. How much is the gaps? How much are the gaps different for the different admission categories at those levels? So as I mentioned, we are using the 2016 census, and we're really focusing on recent immigrants, those who came within the last 10 years, so 2006 onwards. This includes a lot of people who really came under federal skilled workers program, the most traditional economic skilled workers program, but increasingly also includes people who came under the Canadian Experience Class, the PNP, and other economic streams such as the caregiver stream of immigration. So we excluded anyone who was a non-permanent resident, and we also excluded anyone who was a longer-term immigrant. So if you came more than 10 years ago, you were not part of this study. And so we really compared the recent immigrants, those within the last 10 years, to the native-born comparators. Our sample is also restricted to those between 20 and 65 who are working full-time. And the reason for that restriction is that our focus is really on earnings in this particular paper. So we realize that that there is a little bit of sample selection bias in the fact that we're not even looking at those who don't even make it into the labor market at all. So we exclude anyone who's part-time or self-employed, and also obviously anyone who is unemployed. So the census provides 5 broad admission categories. So economic immigrants, family class immigrants, refugees, and other immigrants. So in this paper, we are really focusing only on the economic immigrants. And although the other groups were not excluded, I'm not going to be talking about them in my presentation here because the focus was really on the economic class. So luckily, the census also broke down each of the broad categories into subcategories. So within the economic class, there were subdivisions into skilled worker immigrants. Those came in through the Federal Skilled Workers Program, the Canadian Experience Class, Provincial Nominee Program, and then other economic principal applicants, caregivers, entrepreneurs, etc. So that group is quite a heterogeneous group, and it wasn't really the focus of our analysis. Really, the focus was looking at skilled workers versus the CECs versus the PNPs. Again, we are focusing only on principal applicants because those are the ones that have really been selected for their human capital attributes. So our outcome variable was weekly wages, which we calculated by dividing annual wages by number of weeks earned, weeks worked, in 2015. Unfortunately, there is no hourly wage variable in the census, which prevented more fine-tuned kind of analysis of wages. So we focused on weekly wages. We did control for visible minority status, but in this paper, that wasn't really the focus of our analysis. And then we also controlled for all the other kind of standard demographic and human capital factors that are usually controlled for. In addition to a pooled model where we have both the native born and the recent immigrants all together, we also ran a separate model just for the immigrants. And in that model, we included year since migration and the interaction between year since migration and immigration category to see how potential wages would grow differently in each of the different categories. And we ran all of these separated by gender. So before we get into the actual results, a little bit about the descriptives. So we can clearly see that Canadian-born males earn the most, and their immigrant counterparts lag behind. And this, when I say immigrant here, we're talking about the recent immigrants. Among females, the gap is slightly smaller, but also there. Immigrants tend to be younger, obviously much more likely to be visible minorities than Canadian-born population, and are much more educated, much more likely to have bachelor's degrees, and especially above bachelor's degrees than their Canadian-born counterparts. And then when we look at the different immigration entry classes, you can really see how it breaks down according to the 2015 data. Again, some of the presentations before mine, like Feng's, were a little bit more up to date. And I know that the numbers of some of these categories are changing as we're focusing more and more on Canadian Experience Class and PNP. Those numbers are going up. But according to the 2015 data from the 2016 census, it was about 28% of men who were principal applicants in the skilled category, 5% in the skilled experience, in the Canadian Experience Class, 14% in the Provincial Nominee Program, etc. So if we jump right into the results, the OLS model of weekly earnings, we have here both for the pooled sample as well as for the immigrant-only sample. And what we find is that kind of confirming the results of all previous studies, skilled worker immigrants earn approximately 30% less than their Canadian-born counterparts after controlling for everything else. So here in the pooled model, the reference category are Canadian-born workers. And when we look at the Canadian experience class, it's interesting to note that their earnings disparity is very small. It's only about 2% lower for males and about 10% lower for females. Provincial nominees, on the other hand, are quite disadvantaged relative to their Canadian-born counterparts. So they're about 23 and 27% lower earnings than their Canadian-born counterparts. And the other economic immigrants are even more disadvantaged than the previously mentioned groups. So I think the important thing to highlight here is that other than the Canadian experience class, which still had a disadvantage, but a small one, the other groups still continued to face significant earnings disparity relative to Canadian-born counterparts. So if you look at the rightmost columns, the immigrant-only models, they confirm kind of what Feng was talking about in his presentation, that Canadian experience class applicants do much better than others. So in the immigrant-only models, the principal applicant skilled class are the omitted reference category there. So, we do see that, as kind of we would expect, Canadian experience class do much better than the skilled workers. And provincial nominees also tend to do better than skilled workers. The other interesting finding here is that the years since migration, while positive for everyone, so all immigrants experience an improvement in earnings over time, the interactions with the immigration categories are actually negative and significant. This indicates that although the skilled workers' starting wages, entry wages, are lower than the other categories, their earnings growth is faster. So they do tend to experience some catch-up relative to their other immigration categories, such as the CEC or PNP. So the CEC, PNP, their earnings growth is not as fast as the skilled worker immigrants. So as I mentioned, we also ran the regressions for different within the earnings distribution at different points in the earnings distribution. And we found some kind of interesting results there. So what we find is that at the lowest levels of the earnings distribution, the disadvantage is the least. So in fact, for Canadian experience class, they have higher earnings than Canadian-born workers in that point in the earnings distribution. So they tend to earn more than the lowest earning Canadian-born workers. But when you move higher in the earnings distribution, you find that the disadvantage increases. So it's really at the lowest, at the most disadvantaged positions in society that immigrants and immigrants within the various skilled immigration categories actually experience a slightly better outcome. And those, when you move up into the higher earnings distributions, those kind of advantages disappear. And the story is very similar when you look at females relative to males as well. So moving right along, in terms of the summary, what we find in this empirical analysis is that all admission categories are still associated with a sizable and statistically significant earnings disadvantage relative to the native-born. So the good news story about Canadian experience class and PNP doing better than skilled workers is true, but it still needs to be tempered with the understanding that they're still not up to the earnings levels of their Canadian-born counterparts after considering all the other attributes that we normally consider. So the only exception to that is that principal applicants under the CEC who are in the 10th percentile of the earnings distribution, the lowest level, they do better than their Canadian-born counterparts. And the other interesting finding is that annual earnings growth is highest for skilled worker principal applicants, higher than for the CEC or PNP. So there does seem to be some catch up in that group relative to the other groups, even though they start out lower. So the implication is that although the CEC and PNP streams perform better they still are disadvantaged relative to the native born. That's what we want to stress here. And this underscores some of the points that Naomi made in her very first presentation, that some of the other solutions and initiatives that were put into place, and perhaps more innovative solutions that could be put into place, are still relevant to consider, because the introduction of the CEC and the PNP may not be the silver bullet to get rid of all disadvantage among immigrant workers. So that's really all I have. So mine was nice and short and sweet, so that hopefully we can keep within time.
Thank you very much, Rupa. So yeah, we're almost going full circle in our analysis and back to Naomi's overarching presentation. Okay, I think then it's my turn to raise a few questions, and I think I would like to raise a general question, which is, I think, the underlying thread behind all these presentations. And I think we're here confronted with both a policy and a normative choice, which Naomi kind of phrased quite clearly when she concluded. She said, what is it, the kind of society we want to have in Canada? And I think what I'm hearing is that until about 15 years ago, there was the logic was clearly Canada needs more people, Canada needs immigrants. We bring people here who are from the beginning permanent residents. They have a clear path to citizenship. And once they're here, but also pre-arrival, but particularly post-arrival, we provide for some support so these people can find their position in the labor market and, of course, more generally in society. And particularly since Canada has been gradually moving markedly towards the skilled migrants, towards attracting skilled migrants in line with having what we call a knowledge-based economy. So a concern has been that these people who have been selected on the basis of their skills, among other things, but also Naomi told us also age. So if you allow me, there is also clearly utilitarian in a way perspective. So Canada wants people who are highly skilled and are young, so they're going to contribute to the labor market for a long time. And of course, they will also become citizens and contribute to society. So the idea was, once you're here, selected on these principles, then you find your employment and sort out all these issues. And research has shown that this has not always worked as it should be. So then there has been the idea of trying with different, in different programs and with different ways, that what is called a two-step process. So you come as a temporary migrant, and then you become long-term and become a citizen. And we've seen this has grown numerically, significantly through the years. Now, although I now live in Canada, I think I come here with a bit of a European perspective, and I have to say that for me, it comes as a surprise that in Canada, you can come as a permanent resident. So as Feng also said, you don't try, I mean, there's no trial period. You have to make a decision before you come. I come here and I stay long-term. Of course, you can always leave. But let's say this is a reciprocal marriage. So the country marries you and you marry the country, unless, of course, things turn south. And I want to be provocative, although I'm totally with you, Naomi, on the normative side. And I do see also the downside of the fact that when you are a PR, you have all the same rights except political rights as citizens. So you certainly feel more secure. It provides a basis for integrating, and hence you're likely to feel more secure towards your employer. But I would like to question, do you really? Because probably you don't, for all the reasons that I think the other papers and generally the literature has shown. So that you may still face uncertainty in your employment. The fact that you're PR only goes some way towards doing away with this uncertainty. So, so like being a PR is not a panacea. And what I want to say is with a two-step process, what I see and what I just want to throw into the discussion from a comparative perspective is the norm in many of the big immigrant receiving countries, whether they are proactively immigrant receiving countries like Canada, or even kind of passively, as I would argue, for instance, Germany is. Britain and Sweden, I would say they're a bit half and half, but or the Netherlands is also a big immigrant receiving country, and even Australia, which like Canada is a proactively receiving country. So wouldn't the two-step process be logically a better solution, in that you very clearly match the migrant with a demand in the labor market, and obviously we see that this has beneficial effects in their earnings and in their employment level and in their smooth integration in the labor market, and you do away with underemployment and unemployment and skills mismatch. And it seems to me, and I want just to be provocative and to say, it seems to me that, for instance, the what is it called, the educational credential assessment is a bit of a patch to say, and I know the other study of Rupa and co-authors, it's a bit of a patch to say, oh, eventually the problem is that employers are not very are not very familiar with University X and Y or with employer X and Y in this faraway country. But by doing the credential assessment, we're telling you, yes, guys, you can trust this person. They know how to do this job because we've done this assessment. But we know that often employers don't work in this way. And actually, we have seen this in other places, not in Canada, where chain migration works this way. So you don't have so much the importance of this formal assessment, but you have the importance of the network assessment. So your valued employee tells you, I know a fellow national, a fellow villager that has the same requirements. And I wonder also whether the two-step, with of course a beefing up of the trades category, so what I would call the skilled, not highly skilled category, would work much better, and we would have a better matching. Of course, that would have to come with some, some conditions, which would be, family reunification, or from the beginning bring your family, and with certain rights, with certain labor market mechanisms. So this is my general reflection. I would like to have your reactions, because certainly you're much more of an expert than me. And then I have a couple of very specific questions. So one is for Naomi, if you would like to say something a bit about the mentor, the pre-arrival service of having a mentor, and why this doesn't seem to have worked, and who was this mentor? Because certainly we have seen comparatively that mentorship schemes do work. Another question that I have for Jeff, you did it at the very end of your presentation. You mentioned that we need to look at differences by origin group because it is likely that there is racial discrimination. But you seem to assume there that the employer is white. So I wanted to ask about that, whether you're controlling what is the status, the visible minority or non-visible minority or ethnicity status of the employer. Because we could see that there is a racial discrimination that relates, however, to own group versus other groups. And as the entrepreneurial or the employer class becomes more diverse, this is not white versus non-white. So that was a reflection. I think I'll stop at that. I mean, and several other points, I'm sure we'll come to the discussion. I think it would be a good idea to give the floor in the same order. So give you the latest presenter a bit of a rest and start with Naomi.
Okay, well, you raised a million different issues there, Anna. So I'll try to respond. First of all, I just want to thank the other panelists, because I thought your presentation's really, really interesting and really useful. In terms of two-step immigration, it's not a matter of denying the benefit of two-step immigration. And Feng, I mean, the numbers show it, and your presentation showed it. For those people who are high-end earners as temporary foreign workers in Canada, and then transition to permanent residence, they do very, very well. And I'm less concerned about the high earners than I am about the middle and low earners. The high earners, number one, find it much easier to transition than the middle earners and low earners to permanent residency. And they're not likely to be the ones who are exploited or feel that they don't have rights in this country. So my concern is not for the high-end earners, number one. Number two, I think that Canada used to have, I think, a really good policy for temporary foreign workers. And it was basically, we would bring in people that were really needed because they didn't exist in Canada, either to do short-term work that only had a limited, a finite time limit, or we needed their skills so they could train Canadians or train others already here on a temporary basis, and then they would go home and we would have the skills here. That was the original concept of temporary foreign workers to Canada, because that wasn't the major strategy for Canada. When we selected people to come to Canada, we were selecting citizens to settle and remain in Canada forever. I mean, that was what Canada's strategy was in terms of immigration. We didn't have a guest worker program. We didn't want to have a guest worker program to bring in people to do work that Canadians wouldn't do. That wasn't the intent of our temporary foreign worker program. And over the years, we've come in Canada to relying on temporary foreign workers, primarily at the low end, to do work that Canadians wouldn't do, with no expectation that they would transition to permanent residency and become citizens. And they remained the other, which was something quite different than the original conception. And the high temporary foreign workers were basically being brought in by employers because our permanent residency immigration system was failing. It would take years and years and years for people to be able to come to Canada. The processing was so long, and it was first come, first serve, and it wasn't related to the needs. It was a broken system. So the high-end temporary foreign workers started coming in significant numbers for other than those two reasons that I spoke about earlier, purely as a result of a system breakdown. And we never, even though we fixed the system to a certain degree with express entry, and now people can come in within a 6-month period of applying, that's still not soon enough for a lot of employers who think they need people right away. Frankly, in my view, because for a very long time, employers did not do the planning, human resource planning and training and working with community colleges, et cetera, to develop the workforce, because they knew that there was already gazillions people out there that were ripe for the picking to come in. So why should I train and why should I plan when I can just go and bring people? So I think in the long term, it hasn't been terribly helpful to Canada to go more, to bring in more temporary entrants with work permits than permanent residents. I think we can obviously accommodate many, many, many more permanent residents than we do on an annual basis. Because if we're bringing in, I mean, the latest figures are over 1 million temporary entrants. When you look at all the international students that can work, and when you look at all the other categories of the International Mobility Program, which is going through the roof, we're bringing in many, many, many more temporary entrants with permission to work than we are permanent residents. So I think our system has gotten out of balance. It's gotten away from the original intention of our immigration program, which I actually think wasn't bad. And I also think that we're not taking into account at all that our economy is not just a knowledge-based economy. Yes, we're going there, and yes, with IT and with all that kind of stuff, we're getting there more. But we really need an ongoing basis of people to do the essential work that we have found as a result of COVID and before that we need in this country. And bringing in all those people as temporary foreign workers, I think is not healthy for our society. So that's where I come from. But I think allowing temporary foreign workers who are here for the right reasons to then transition to permanent residency and bring all the skills and benefit, and for them to benefit from the fact that they have pre-immigration experience, great. I'm not saying do away with two-step immigration, not at all. But I'm saying let's look at our temporary foreign worker program and our international mobility program to see if they're actually serving the needs that we need and that we want, and make that an almost prerequisite to become a permanent resident, which I think is really problematic. Does that?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I just want to put in 2 footnotes, and then we go around with the others, and maybe so one thing is you seem to assume the employers are large employers. What happens with, I mean, it's only the large employers that can train and can plan. And the economy has changed in the last 20 years. I mean, the economy has structurally changed and the labor market has structurally changed. And the kind of jobs that immigrants take are different. Also the kind of jobs that natives take, or natives like Canadian born. And the labor trajectories and the welfare trajectories have changed. So I think we need to factor this in. And second, I would think the transition, right now the transition, and that's where we see actually also the inequality of the system is, so if you're a seasonal farm worker, you can do whatever you want. If you're somebody who is not highly skilled, it's very difficult to transition to PR. But if the transition was only based on your length of stay, so you stay 2 years plus 2 years, after that you're permanent resident, or you stay 3 years, you're permanent resident. It doesn't matter if you have elementary school or a doctorate. So that is the 2-step system that I was thinking of. So once you come in because there is a job and you come in and you integrate, then you become, I mean, this is the logic in many other countries. And I think it's working. And in a way, I mean, I want to again play devil's advocate and say it's also in a way fairer to third countries. Because right now, what we see in Canada is also, Canada is harvesting the graduates of countries that have a lot less money to educate their people. Precisely because you need to be really highly skilled with a BA and possibly an MA to come to Canada, whether in one category or the other. But yeah, let me, I mean, I will, let me actually turn, how can I say, the comment or the answer to Jeff, and he could tell us his views.
Yes, I just wanted to, you asked about the racial discrimination issue, and the reason why we discuss that in the paper is that many people had suggested that the reason for the racial disparities in the economic outcomes of immigrants generally was that the racial minority immigrants, the Blacks and Asians, are actually coming into the country with poorer qualifications than immigrants from Europe or the United States. And so that the idea of upgrading that qualification by requiring an assessment prior to their arrival would weed out the relatively less qualified people from Africa and Asia. And so I thought it was important to look at, when we found that the credential equivalence requirement was actually having an effect, whether that was eliminating the racial disparities. And so that's why I think it's important to note that in the data analysis, the racial disparities are still there. And it's particularly important that they're there for people whose qualifications have been in fact assessed as equivalent. I mean, it just confirms that what we know from many other studies, which is that there is a significant degree of racial discrimination in the Canadian labor market. And it's not solved by selecting you know, immigrants with higher levels of qualification. So that's my comment. I have a question about, or I wanted to make a comment on the 2-step.
Please go ahead.
If I can do that. You know, there's, one point is that, of course, one of the advantages that the immigrants with previous Canadian experiences have is they have a head start. And so that really matters. And it matters especially in assessing data on this issue, because many of these immigrants who are temporary become permanent they've increased in numbers in recent years. So we don't have a long-term outcome for these people. And so their head start may have a particularly large impact on the assessment that we're making of how well they're doing now. And I think we should be cautious about that. And the other point is that we talk about them as a category without really knowing much about who they are. What are the skill levels of these folks? What kinds of occupational, we know that they're supposed to be at the highest skill level equivalent to people selected under the point system, but they also may be in trades and various other occupations that would not have qualified under the previous point system. So how many of those folks are we bringing in? And are they the ones whose earnings are relatively high compared to native-born Canadians in those trades? Or which group is really doing better? It's surprising to me that we're able to get very many really highly qualified immigrants through the temporary foreign worker program to become permanent immigrants. We know that from the experience with with express entry, that the government was hoping that employers would go into the pool and select immigrants at the highest skill levels in large numbers. And that didn't happen. In fact, they've sort of abandoned the idea of giving points for employer selection in that system. So I think we need to know a lot more about how we're getting so many of these people doing so well in the labor market through this two-step process. And it can't be analyzed just as a single category. We need to break it down and look at the composition of that group, what kind of occupations they're in, what kind of industries are benefiting, and so on.
If I could just mention, the other thing that occurs to me with the two-step migration in particular is, we have these people who are making high earnings, over 50,000, who do very well. And from what I saw of Feng's graphs, everyone else is actually quite close to those who have no experience at all. There's a slight improvement for the lower and middle level earners, but not nearly to the level of the high earners. And yet that high level group is very small, right? It's not like most of the people coming in through IMP, even though the perception is that they're the best of the best, they must be cherry picked here through the IMP program. That's in fact not true. There's a huge diversity of people who get hired through the IMP program and therefore get access to permanent resident status. And so, as we saw in his presentation, those who come in through, say, IMP, through CEC's classes, who didn't have this high level of earnings beforehand, they don't get that kind of benefit. So in fact, in many ways, there's a greater heterogeneity in immigrant outcomes now that we have these small groups of people who are doing quite well, and then everybody else still not doing very well, that the disadvantage still exists, but it's just that there's actually a wider range of of outcomes within the immigrant, within recent immigrants. And then the other thing I want to mention is, I think, Anna, you asked, how do we know the actual ethnic background of the employers? Of course, in our study, the one with myself and Jeff and Feng and Ting, we don't know, right? Because that's really just about employment status and earnings. We don't know who their employer is. But the fact of the matter is that one thing we do know is that temporary foreign workers who, CEC class immigrants, or those who come in with earnings before landing in Canada, they're competing with immigrants who came straight from abroad. So although we don't know the actual characteristics of the employers, we know that primarily the competitors of those CEC job applicants, or people who came in through the CEC class and then became permanent residents, their job applicants, their competitors are mostly other immigrants, actually, and other immigrants who didn't have the Canadian experience. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, in a roundabout way, is that although some are benefiting, a lot of people are actually perhaps suffering more because there are these other groups of immigrants in the labor market now who employers see as being, you know, a better fit because they already have Canadian experience. Why would we hire this person from abroad? Whereas once before, when basically immigrants meant they didn't have Canadian experience. So they were all kind of in more of the same boat. Whereas now we have this wider disparity of outcomes among immigrants.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think the employer wants an employee, and the employee may be immigrant or maybe or foreign born or native born, haven't been for long in Canada or having just arrived. I think the employer does not say, I want the PR or not the PR. The employer says, I want somebody who knows the ways, or I want somebody whom I can assess. And then, of course, we try to figure out how the different policies affect this. So before, what you're saying is there was a pool of workers that had no Canadian experience, and there was another bigger pool of workers that had Canadian experience. Whether these were PRs or citizens, or they are today temporary migrants, doesn't really matter for, I think, for the employer, to the extent that they have a secure legal status.
Okay, I think that is where there is there are some issues that merit discussion. There are many different employers in the world, and many different employers in Canada, and they will have very different motivations for who they hire. And there are some employers who say, I want someone, I'm going to assess someone purely on their skill sets and purely on what, you know, I need from them that they can do. And I want to keep them, and I want to pay them well and treat them well and train them and keep them in my organization for a long time. And that means I want a permanent resident because I want to know that they're rooted to the family and to the community. And I want to know that I can afford to invest. It makes sense for me to invest in them because they're going to be loyal and they're going to stay. That employer may not want a temporary foreign worker. There are other employers who may say, you know, I know that I'm supposed to pay them appropriately and the same. I know that I'm supposed to have the same working conditions, but they are going to be on a work permit only with me. And I know that they want the job and they want the work and they want to send home their remittances. And I may be able to get a little bit more out of them than I might get a permanent resident or a Canadian person because they are tied to me. I'm not saying that those are the majority of employers, they aren't. But there are a number of employers who deliberately would far prefer to hire a temporary foreign worker than a permanent resident, and those who would far prefer to hire a permanent resident than a temporary foreign worker. And we know it because we've interviewed employers and we've done all kinds of discussions with employers who are big employers of temporary foreign workers, and many of them say, I don't want to hire temporary foreign workers. Find me some permanent residents and I'd be delighted to have them. And others who say the temporary foreign workers are exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose the image is even further complicated in relation to the sector, the job qualifications, and everything else. Let me give the floor to Feng, who has been patiently waiting to comment on our discussion.
Yeah, I think I want to first get back to Rupa's comments about the different groups within the two-step immigrants. I think that's actually the exact point we have been trying to argue in some of our reports, in our papers, is that when we talk about the selection, talking about Canadian experience, talking about the two-step selection, the really benefit is in terms of immigrant outcomes is those with high pre-Canadian earnings. So if you look at the current selection system, when they give a lot of points to Canadian experience, what is the measure is based on how many years of experience they have in Canada. It's either like 1 year got 40 points or 4 years got 80 points. So what we're saying is like really that is not a good measure. You really need to look at the level of pre-immigration earnings, which is like a much better measure because you can actually verify it from say your income return. I also want to clarify that actually the share with what we call a high level of pre-immigration Canadian is not that small. It's actually about 30% among people who transition from temporary foreign work to permanent residence. So 30%. So it's not a very small. And for the median level, it's about 50%. So actually, it's a huge chunk of them. Like for those with lower earnings, like less than 20,000, which is really low, we still have like about 20%. So I think that is the proportion temporary foreign work, either temporary foreign work or become a permanent resident. That's a concern Naomi has. But I can say that's concern. But the problem, what I say is like the problem with the low-skilled temporary foreign work is still there if we let them become immigrants. Actually, many of them did become permanent residents. When we in our previous studies, we actually look at the transition, the rate of transition in the permanent residence by skill levels. What we found is that it's only among seasonal agriculture work that really don't have a way to become permanent residents. But a lot other temporary foreign works, their chance of become permanent residents is just as high as highly skilled immigrants. The reason is because the transition depends on two factors. One is motivation, another one is opportunities. For high skilled temporary foreign work, there's lots of opportunity for them to make a transition, but their motivation is not that high. But for lowly skilled immigrants, their opportunity is limited, but they're highly motivated. They find a way, like mostly through provincial nominee program. So the transition is not that low. Many of them become permanent residents. The problem is like if we look at the earning trajectory, as Jeff said, if we take into account their years before immigration, the advantage, the head start, then immigrants came directly from abroad. Those who work as low-skilled temporary foreign work, they actually make less than than immigrants come directly from abroad. So in a sense, like if they have had an advantage before immigration, they will continue to have an advantage after immigration. So if we bring in, instead of say, let temporary foreign work to do those low-skill jobs, we hire, like let immigrants directly come into Canada do those kind of jobs. I think the problem is still going to be there because I think it comes to the much bigger problem is what we want immigration for. Do we really want immigrants come to Canada to actually do jobs that the Canadian cannot do, bring the skills we don't have? Or do we want to bring immigrants, either in temporary form or permanent form, to do jobs that the Canadians can do but doesn't want to do because the job pays a little or the working condition is poor? So the question is like whether we want to keep bringing either the immigrants or temporary foreign work to expand those part of those segment of precarious job, or we want to like improve the earnings, improve the working condition of those jobs, and encourage Canadians to take on those jobs. Yeah, that's.
Sorry, and I wanted to mention there, encourage Canadians to take on those jobs, or encourage employers to have better earnings and better working conditions, right? That's
right.
Yeah, I think Feng's contribution has been very balanced, and I think since we have been going on for quite long, it's and unfortunately we cannot have a live conference with having questions from the public. It's time to wrap up. I think this is a good point, and it's very timely as you know, the COVID-19 crisis has shown that truly that there are important sectors in the labor market and in society that have been overlooked, regardless of whether the people who work there are, you know, in different statuses, temporary or long-term permanent citizens, Canadian-born, etc. And I think this, of course, goes back to the initial question that Naomi raised, which is what kind of society do we want to live in? And I think the five of us agree that we want to live in an equitable society. And let me take this opportunity to thank you all for your very interesting papers and presentations, and for having solved all the technical glitches, hopefully. And we look forward to the next occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.